This year, the CrossFit Games began with the biggest disaster in Games history and the tragic passing of Lazar Dukic. And yet, it seems the show must go on. The CrossFit Games is usually a highlight in the year for the CrossFit community. However, this year that light quickly turned dark when Lazar Dukic lost his life during the swim portion of the first event. Now, I'm not here to tell you who is responsible for that or to start pointing fingers. A man lost his life. That will be thoroughly investigated by people outside of CrossFit. And I, for one, am naive enough to believe that if the secular authorities are involved, CrossFit cannot sweep that under the rug. Those that are responsible will be held accountable. In the meantime, people that were there, they've also shared accounts of what they saw happening and what they were doing at that time. So you can go to those people for additional information as well. But while we wait for that report to come out, we can just look ahead at what happened next. Because on Thursday, CrossFit were now faced with a decision they had to make, and it was an impossible one. No matter what they chose to do, it was definitely going to be the wrong decision in some people's eyes. So at this point, I'm interested to know what decision you would have made. Would you have continued with the games as CrossFit did, or maybe you would have cancelled the games, as some were suggesting? In fact, almost immediately on social media, people were calling for the games to be cancelled, or the games to be postponed some months. Perhaps the prize money to be given to Lazar's family, or maybe to be divided between the athletes that were there to cover some of their expenses. Now, while it's clear to see where this feeling came from or why people would want such a decision to be made, how realistic a possibility was that? Well, just look at a few factors. For example, if somebody lives relatively close to the games, maybe it's a few hours, a day's travel by car, it being cancelled, them having to go back home, it's not the end of the world. But what about all the people that have travelled to the games from far away, from overseas? And we're not just talking about the athletes, but all of the volunteers, all of the spectators. They are not going to be able to get home maybe for quite a few days. Their travel arrangements are all locked in. So what are they going to do for the next days if the games is cancelled? Just be stuck there. Perhaps they're far away from friends, families, those that could provide the emotional support they might need at that time. So the game's continuing for them, maybe that was a good thing. Maybe that is something that could distract them, allow them to come together as a community. And then we do have to think about financial things as well, right? Vendors, they've spent a lot of money to be there. Maybe that was a financial risk for them, but they were confident they would be able to get that money back from sales at the games. Well, if it's cancelled, what are they going to do? And then we can think about sponsors, those that CrossFit has made an obligation to, and that obligation can only be fulfilled if there is a final product, if the games is there. Now, while some of these reasons, and obviously these are not all of the reasons, but just some of the contributing factors into these decisions, some might seem cold-hearted, purely financial, but that is the reality. That is why CrossFit were never going to cancel the games. So what's the alternative? Just go ahead as if nothing happened. Well, we know that didn't happen. CrossFit did make some adjustments. There was a memorial to Lazer on the Friday morning, and then events resumed after that. And these decisions as well were not taken solely by CrossFit. We know athletes and other representatives were brought in to discuss the situation. However, it feels like the thing they weren't given was time. Many expressed the feeling that they would have liked to have had that whole Friday off as an opportunity to, yes, remember and honour Lazer, but also to grieve, to reflect on what had happened, to think seriously about what the next step they wanted to take was going to be. Now, of course, that didn't happen. CrossFit did perform a kind of middle ground in the sense that they allowed athletes, if they didn't want to take to the field straight away, they would have been allowed to rejoin the competition afterwards. Now, that is unprecedented, but it was also sort of a token gesture, really. In fact, what we saw happening was quite the opposite. Athletes that maybe felt they needed to return to the field, and maybe that was the best way for them to handle their grief, well, after an event or after a day, we saw quite a number withdraw from competition. It just didn't sit well with them. Now, a big focus of the games now became, how do we honour Lazer? But that was a little bit muddy in general, wasn't it? Because if it had been a tragic car accident on the way to the games, no doubt the whole community, all the athletes, they would have rallied. The games would have been a perfect opportunity for them to celebrate the life of this man. But the fact that many felt it was the games that was responsible in the first place, it just didn't sit right with them that this was the best way to honour the man. And then individually, athletes tried to do things to show a little bit of honour and respect to Lazer and his family. For example, some would wait a minute once the 3-2-1 go went, and they would give that minute to Lazer in his honour, and then join the competition. But when it's just one athlete doing it, and maybe the other 9 have jumped straight in and started doing their reps, it just feels a little bit off. It's almost like they're disrespecting the respect that person is trying to give. And that's not the intent, obviously. It would be like somebody holding a minute's silence and there is a baby screaming nearby, or a small child. They're not deliberately trying to disrespect what that person is doing. But from the outside looking in, it just feels a little bit off. And then, of course, another thing to keep in mind is the fact that people grieve in different ways. And that is emphasized even more so by the fact we had athletes from different parts of the world. So depending on your background, your upbringing, your beliefs, you're going to process grief in a different way. And we saw this. This is probably why some athletes did feel that they could continue with the competition, and then they ended up withdrawing because it just didn't sit right with them. That wasn't the right thing for them to do. But for others, maybe it was the right thing for them to do. This was a way for them to channel their grief, the anger, the frustration that they were feeling. Or maybe they were thinking about the volunteers, the spectators, those that had traveled that way. What were they going to do? Is this an opportunity for them to distract them, to give them something positive in a moment that was obviously very negative? The problem was that even when they were competing, it was very bittersweet. If somebody won an event or a heat, dare they celebrate? Well, they would immediately be called out on social media. How disrespectful. How could you be happy at a time like this? But ultimately, it just feels a bit off as a competition. It feels like back in the COVID era where we had the games and people have that kind of mental asterisk where it's like, yes, you competed, or yes, you finished in this position, but it was the COVID games. It feels like it's going to be a little bit like that, which is very unfortunate because no doubt it was probably one of the hardest games for these athletes to ever have done. It wasn't just physically exhausting, it will have been mentally and emotionally exhausting too. So they are to be commended for the incredible efforts they were able to put up, if that's what they honestly felt was the right thing for them to do. Or maybe there was another option. Maybe there was some kind of middle ground. You don't cancel the games outright, but you turn it into an exhibition in honor of Lazer. You wipe the scoreboard. It's all about taking part, you bringing in the community, trying to distract them from this tragedy. And yes, the prize money gets shared equally between everyone, or a large portion gets donated to Lazer's family, whatever it may be. Ultimately, there was never going to be a right decision, and the important thing to remember is whatever decision is made stems from a tragic event that had occurred. Now, of course, as always, I'm interested to know what other people think. What would you have done, and how does this affect not just the CrossFit Games, but maybe future events that we see down the line as well? Thinking about the teens, the masters, the adaptive, all these events are yet to come. But the most important thing to remember is that all of these decisions and this whole discussion just stems from one tragic event, and one we should not soon forget.